Kingsmill, next week I'm at the World Economic Forum in Davos. What are the global elite, the leadership of the world's corporates? What do they need to understand about the energy transition?
So they need to understand that because energy is power, a new energy system which is coming will mean a very different power structure.
What does that mean if I'm the CEO of a major corporate, a major energy consumer? I mean, what does that mean for me?
So in country terms, and we looked at it in country terms in this report,
and this report being the report you've done with IRENA.
So this is a report written by the Commission on the Geopolitics of the Energy Transformation, and we helped write this report in Carbon Tracker, and there is a series of conclusions which the report comes up with. But from the perspective of your CEO, there's a series of countries which today are relatively low users of energy and import a lot of their energy. So, for example, India, Pakistan, Thailand, and what this new domestic cheap energy source will enable them to do is, first of all, to reduce their imports, which would have a beneficial impact on their currency, and then secondly, to significantly increase their consumption of energy, which will drive much faster growth.
And this report, IRENA is a sort of international body for the renewables industry, is that correct?
It's the International Renewable Energy Agency, and they convened the Commission, but the Commission itself is separate to IRENA.
And it's really focused on a new geopolitics?
Yes, so we're focusing on a new power structure. So if you think about it, at the moment, the world's geopolitical environment is very much linked to fossil fuels. So, for example, the US-Saudi relationship, or the relationship between China and Russia, and the fossil fuel sector has a very deep reach into the way that geopolitics is constructed. As renewables replace fossil fuels in the energy mix, that will create a very different environment, one which is much more collegiate, based upon electricity, based upon land links, and actually much more upon reciprocity.
Much more of a level playing field.
It's much more a level playing field because basically every country in the world has renewable energy or the potential to have renewable energy. So it's actually a very positive, democratising force.
That kind of feeds. What are the key themes I think for Davos this year is globalisation, a new form of globalisation, 4.0, in the context of a fourth industrial revolution. So this kind of fits quite nicely with that.
It does fit extremely nicely because the fourth industrial revolution is additive manufacturing, for example, and printing and local sourcing. Now, of course, you have a local energy source as well. Right. And I think we will see this is all part and parcel of a different world that's arising, which will for sure be more local, and I think we'll see very significant pressures upon the nation state.
So you used the term energy independence.
Yes.
But in a sense, in the 20th century, we had a lot of independence from colonialism. Is this a kind of is an analogy here a sort of independence from energy colonialism?
That's an interesting one. I think it's certainly worth mentioning that 3% of global GDP ends up in basically in oil rents, which go to a relatively small number of countries and a small number of people, and are used by them to project power and do whatever they want to do with it. And certainly their ability to project power will be constrained. So one of the messages from the report, for example, is to say to the countries which have built their economies upon fossil fuels that they need to transition. They need to transition their economies, and actually, strangely enough, in the long term, that will also benefit them because of the nature of the resource curves.
Well, we can see the reality here. I think you recently bought yourself an electric bike. We're in an electric bike shop in Bermondsey High Street.
Yes.
So you can almost see these bikes. They look amazing, don't they? So we see the reality
all around us. So it was very interesting. So I think most people now accept that the electricity sector is transitioning to renewable sources, and here we have behind us the first wave of the transport transition. And to remind you, the world has 250 million electric bicycles, but China has 240 million of those. So actually, this is another aspect of the transition. It's very much led by the emerging markets, specifically by China. And this will act as another pillar of Chinese leadership in the new century, unless, of course, America has a Sputnik moment, wakes up and realizes what's going on.
Well, I mean, it's almost like it deals with the whole equity issue around climate change in many ways. I mean, it gives those countries potential competitive advantage, or at least a level playing field in the world.
I think it's really important to say that this energy transition to local energy will, by definition, be a much more just system. So
a just transition.
It is a just transition because you, as I mentioned, 4 people out of 5 live in countries which import fossil fuels from abroad. Now they will have local energy sources. It will drive local jobs and much faster local development in countries which have hitherto been able to do so. So, provided we are able to get capital to countries which don't have the capital, I think this could be a very, very positive, just force for change.
I mean, the just transition is really important, and we've been talking about a low carbon transition, I mean, for decades, and there's always been barriers. I mean, I guess economics and the financials has been a barrier until recently, and I guess the disruptive impact on incumbents, both ordinary people who are employed in industries that get disrupted, but also investors who have money tied up in those industries. Well, I mean, what's different now, do you think?
So I think the main thing that's different now is that renewable energy sources are cheaper than fossil fuel energy sources.
So we're going for an economic tipping point.
So we have an economic tipping point. The economic tipping point will be followed, I would suggest, by a political tipping point.
Yes, something we've both been talking about for a while.
As politicians realise where the future lies. But it's also worth saying that there are more people employed in a renewable energy economy than in a fossil fuel economy. So actually, when you're talking about justice and jobs, there will be more jobs and many more local jobs in a renewable energy economy. And today, for example, already more people working in the solar sector in the United States than in the whole of the coal, oil and gas sector in the United States. And globally, there's 10 million people working in the renewable energy industry.
Wow. Well, I've been told also that's very similar. I've been told anecdotally, but it's very similar to the offshore wind industry in the UK versus the offshore oil and gas industry.
Yes.
Now. So we've been through that transition. In fact, a lot of offshore oil and gas geologists have become engineers have become engineers in the offshore wind industry.
Yes, indeed, my own son, that's what his own direction is. He wants to go into the renewable energy industry.
So you and I have been we've been very much talking about you're writing a paper, or we've come up with this idea for a paper of the political tipping point that follows the economic tipping point. Yes. And I've often thought about this in terms of until now you've had to put climate policy in place to incentivize maybe technologies that are not quite as good or more expensive.
Yes.
But now that policy it will be incentivizing technologies that are more efficient and they're cheaper.
Yes, and I think this notion of a tipping point is really important because in the old days, as you point out, renewables required subsidy, and that subsidy created some resistance. So, for example, the very high cost of the German energy vendor. The current situation now is that renewables in an increasing number of countries are cheaper than fossil fuels, and that creates a completely different dynamic. Not merely can you remove the subsidies, but you can start to tax fossil fuels for the externalities that they undoubtedly impose upon society. And that tax will not need to be borne by the consumer, provided you do it correctly, because renewable costs are lower, and therefore that tax will act as a kind of tax wedge, taking away the super profits of the fossil fuel industry. So it would have a number of very significant benefits as we transition from subsidy to taxation of externalities.
So there's been a lot discussed about China. I did one of these interviews with Dr. Ma Jun, China's kind of Mr. Green and climate finance. We talked a lot about that, but the United States, I mean, I saw an interesting piece today from the energy editor of the FT about this idea, a sort of Roosevelt-style New Deal, but a Green New Deal.
Yes.
Do you think that has legs in the US?
It's very interesting. One of the arguments that we make in this piece is that China has overtaken the United States, and that energy leadership has in the past led to political leadership. So the inference that one could take would be that if the United States persists down the dead end of the dying fossil fuel industry, it will be leapfrogged much more rapidly by China. So I fully expect, as a result, that there will be a kind of Sputnik moment in the US where people wake up to the risks of being leapfrogged by China, and they realize that they need to embrace the fossil fuel transition all the more rapidly. And I would suggest that possibly the Green New Energy Deal may be a part of that. But interestingly enough, this is an argument which should appeal to Republicans just as much as it appeals to Democrats, because otherwise they will end up playing second fiddle, which I don't believe they wish to do.
Well, it's about geopolitics. It's about the economy. So, what would be, if you had one key message that you could get across in Davos to the sort of world's business and political leadership? What would it be?
I think the one key message would be, you need to embrace this because it's in your own interest to do so. So if in the past the debate has been we should help the renewables industry, we should help the transition because we're helping out the planet, actually no. Because we pass these economic and political tipping points, if you fail to change, you will end up becoming irrelevant. So I think the message we would like to put across is change or die.
And so that's the global elite, because they also have to think about the stranded communities. I mean, we've seen this with the so-called in France.
Yes.
I mean, what about those communities? I mean, how do you reassure them that this is in their interests as well?
So I think you need, as with all change, you need to support the people who are damaged by change. But at the same time, you need to take you need to do a holistic analysis of the impact of the current system versus the new system. So in the current system, you have 7 million people a year dying of outdoor air pollution. You have the prospect of catastrophic global warming, and you have a system which sends very large rents to a very small number of people. None of those is especially just. So we need to recognise that there are advantages and disadvantages to both systems, and as we are moving to the new one, we need to support the victims of the old, but it needs to be support to individuals, not to the capital that's financing them necessarily. And that's surely an important distinction. We can support the coal miners, but we don't need to support the coal owners, I would suggest.
No, exactly. And I guess, the technological genie is out of the bag anyway. And I mean, denial and resistance isn't really an option. I mean, the disruption will come from the technology to some degree anyway.
Well, to every degree. I mean, it's a lot of people liken those who wish to hold back the transition to King Canute, and with the tide coming in, and it's very, very hard to resist.
I've used that slide a few times, but yes.
It's very hard to resist the technological transition that's happening, because these technologies are on learning curves, about 20% for every doubling capacity. They're on S-curves of growth. The combination of those things is pretty unstoppable. And actually the most interesting, albeit extremely predictable aspect of this transition is that the only people who can't see change coming are the incumbents.
Yes.
And 'twas ever thus.
Yeah, I mean, history is littered with incumbents who didn't survive the transition. Kingsmill, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. Really want to get some comments. As always, please comment on the video and get involved in the discussion. And subscribe to the Green Atomic channel. Thank you, Kingsmill.